I've been talking a lot about hate recently, because that enemy has been knocking at the door in America. Most frequently, a voice from the riots in Milwaukee ensured that this violence was, quote, only a day away, unquote. Now, what I will have on screen shortly here is footage of the Tank Man in Tiananmen Square in 1989. There are a lot of facts that separate this from what's going on in America, but I'm going to focus on the similarity. A protest blocking a roadway. I wanted to grab footage of the Ferguson protests where they were blocking cars, or the Black Lives Matter movement blocking cars on roads and interstates. But unfortunately, everything I find is either too graphic, or it has a biased text narration accompanying it. If you want to see protests blocking roads, getting run over, and struck at high speeds by vehicles, you can search it on YouTube yourself and find plenty. I realize I will be doing the same. I will be taking a video and applying a commentary. In the case of the protests against police killings of blacks, the heart of the Black Lives Matter movement, the protesters are obstructing roadways, obstructing other people from traveling to work, home, family, what have you. Most of the people in the traffic that they are stopping have little or nothing to do with racism or the police killings of blacks. The worst things the motorists participate in, although loosely, is paying their taxes, which then fund government and law enforcement processes which could negatively impact the community, and that's making a rather large leap. That's the worst thing most of these travelers have done to Black America. And if they didn't pay their taxes, they would be drugged to court, to jail. They'd be carried off at gunpoint by the IRS. I say that to hate someone is to take their humanity from them. To hate someone is to say that they are a thing to be stolen from and bring violence upon. To hate someone is to say they're not like you and me, they are monsters. These peaceful protests from Black Lives Matter are criminally orchestrated movements of chaos to get people to hate one another on a racial basis, on a status basis. Criminally orchestrated movements of chaos to weaken the strength of the American community. The protesters are stopping the motorists because the motorists, without knowing a thing about them, the motorists are heartless racists that must be scolded for their crimes against the black community. They must be drug out from their vehicles and beaten. These motorists aren't people. They are stopping the motorists as if the motorists were the problem. The motorists are not the problem, and stopping them is not the solution, especially not at random. I'll start now with this footage by saying that in world history, the Chinese government has supposedly killed more of its own people than any other government, by an astounding margin. I will walk back to personal responsibility. It was agents of the Chinese government that have killed more of its own people than any other government's agents in world history. A government is an idea. Murderers are people. So you have here a Chinese citizen and Chinese soldiers. People. All of them human. The soldiers are in tanks, and to end this man's life is of no substantial consequence. Or at least that's the perception of most watchers, and probably the Chinese government at the time. This is all my opinion. This man saw he could stand in opposition to the murder of his fellow people, and he did. He didn't start attacking the tank. Sure, he climbed up on it. Looks as if it were to start a conversation. He knew there were people in that tank. People that didn't want to kill him, or at least didn't choose to kill him. People that didn't hate him enough to take his life. So you have agents of the Chinese government, historically having the highest record of murdering its own citizenry, and a civilian. Neither side hates one another enough to bring violence at this time. Words are being tried. This was a prolific moment in history, and I encourage you to look into the full story. This man didn't get shot, killed, run over, even though it would not have been dangerous or difficult for the people in the tanks to do so, because they didn't hate him and dehumanize him. He, in their eyes, was still a human being, and they, in his eyes, were human beings. It could be a simple difference in culture. China, especially at the time, is a lot more homogenous than America. To be the racist that I am, they all look the same. They had less differences than we do across the states, and so common ground for compassion held a lot more acreage in the minds and the hearts of their people. We have a much more powerful and segregated hatred in America, fomented by people who are supposed to be our leaders, fueling the fires of division amongst us peasants with signs and torches. I say again that blocking random interstates is lashing out at random people, and blind hate often gets hatred in return, because it can't be reasoned with. You can't talk to anybody that hates you for no reason. In the earlier footage, it was a citizen against military agents. Not even a policeman. Military agents in military equipment against one civilian. In America today, it is American people protesting on a roadway, blocking other American people who happen to be on that road at the time of the protest. These protesters hate random motorists at random that day. They hate the motorists enough that communication is not an option. Only obstruction and destruction of property. Only the honor badge of a police response to validate their internal victim theory about racism and police oppression. And the drivers behind the wheels of those vehicles? Again, if you search, you'll see plenty that aren't halting for these human blockades. You'll see plenty of people getting run over. You'll see plenty of people getting hit. The drivers behind the wheels hate the protesters enough to run them over, to strike them at interstate speeds, because the protesters aren't human beings. The protesters are the problem. The protesters aren't like you and me. They're monsters. The motorists, they're the problem. They aren't like you and me. They're monsters. We have civilians on both sides of a conflict, seated in tribal racism, hiding from the truth of decency, and sparked by the abuse of authority. Guess what? The only authority here is might makes right, and a vehicle is more powerful than a standing person. Strange in contrast that one person, making a moral stand, has his grievance recognized, and impedes an entire column of tanks. Tanks which can drive through buildings. And if you watch the videos of the roadblocks in America, entire crowds of people with an illegitimate grievance are getting plowed over by other citizens, not agents of the government, not police, but other citizens, who also have an illegitimate grievance, but they're backed by an SUV. I know, not all motorists, not all protesters. But when witness to this contrast, I see a clear message. We have lost our knowledge on how to contest the abuse of authority. When filled with the hate of being wronged, those who move to action move against anyone who isn't standing right beside them. It is a microwave dinner of a revolution being sold to intellectually and morally lazy people. We used to, in America, made in the USA, we used to grow our own revolutions, pull it up from the ground, and take time to cook it correctly. I am certain that there are people still contesting these wrongdoings through more effective and peaceable means than walking out into traffic and blaming Whitey for getting hit. I'm certain there are people that want a person who does something wrong to answer for that wrong, and not for that person's community, employer, family, or ethnicity to shoulder the blame for their actions. In one of the more particularly graphic scenes I witnessed, on an interstate, a lone individual wearing dark clothing at night got torn apart by a high-speed impact after standing out in traffic by themselves. The crowd supporting the protest is screaming in shock and surprise. Oh my God! I can't believe! How could this happen? How could you?" And yet, if this man in Tiananmen Square got run over by the tanks that he stood in front of, a more appropriate response would be delivered. What did he think was going to happen? Such is the contrast between a person acting against the problem and a person who has been worked up and aggravated, blinded, and then set loose.